Welcome back to Tide Pod on the YouTube home of TideIllustrated.com. Jack Knowlton, Tony Sakalis coming at you roughly, I guess for us, roughly 24 hours after we started our day at Bryant-Denny Stadium yesterday. We're recording this at about 2 p.m. on Sunday. We were there at about 2 p.m. on Saturday to watch Nick Saban, get honored and get the field dedicated to him. And then the game that proceeded to happen on the newly coined Saban Field was not quite up to the snuff of the legendary former coach who was watching, Tony. Alabama beating South Florida 42-16. Scoreline does not tell the whole story, as many people listening to this will know, having watched the game, as you and I know, having watched it. We're going to give our reactions, talk about some specifics with the game, a few talking points to dive into. One good, mostly bad, but just kind of in general, Tony, and I'll preface this, I think, with the penalties, which is, I think, the biggest takeaway. 13 penalties for Alabama for 120 yards. Talk just about the general kind of sloppiness of this game, both with those penalties and just in general with what you observed before we kind of dive in.
Yeah, this is something we've seen from Alabama in recent years. And you thought that maybe they were going to shake it. This is something we've talked about, like these extreme amounts of penalties, maybe for like the last 3 years. You're going to end up losing games because of this. I mean, we've seen Alabama be hurt by this before. And I think that's, a big reason why they took a while to pull away. If you look, I'm not sure they didn't have very many penalties in the fourth quarter, right?
No, none.
And that's when they pulled away. I mean, so there's no. I mean, the correlation right there is pretty simple enough. That should tell you all you need to know. It's not just the yards, the 130 yards they lost. That's like how you chart it, but I mean, they lost so many more yards than that. You lost a 74-yard touchdown because of a holding penalty on Wilkin Formby. You also lost another touchdown on a holding play. What was it, like a 30-something yard touchdown, I believe, on a holding penalty by Geno VanDeMark. And then, there was a dual penalty on a holding call by Wilkin Formby that would have been like a 50-yard pass or something like that. It was pass interference, but the player caught it anyways. Well, it got negated because there was also a holding on that play. So it's just like you lose so many yards and multiple touchdowns on just sloppiness like that. And then we're not even talking yet about the turnovers, but there were 3 of those as well, so those are the kind of things that are going to kill Alabama in games where they're playing tougher competition. And you mentioned, Nick Saban. This is the kind of game that Nick Saban would hate, the undisciplined, turnovers, and then you still get that blowout win, which creates a false confidence. I mean, like, these are the kind of games that we would have definitely had a Saban tirade after this game. He just would have wanted to make a statement to his players. So it's just kind of ironic that this is the game that he gets honored at, because he hated it. I'm sure he hated every moment of that game watching it.
Yeah, I would agree. I think before we dive into the specifics, we're going to talk right tackle first. We're going to talk about the turnovers, talk about Jalen Milroe as well. You mentioned Saban and how he would have had a rant afterward. I'm curious your thoughts, having sat through many of those Saban rants before, having sat through the South Florida game last year, which did not go the way of Alabama, which clearly should not schedule the Bulls anymore.
We still got one more in this 2-for-1, though.
There you go.
From now, we'll be doing this again.
They're running this back. But just having seen some of what Saban, or some of Saban's rants and some of those moments, how do you feel DeBoer handled it? I mean, I think we've all been so curious on how he's going to be when things aren't positive. Obviously, you can spin fall and spring camp all you want. Had a blowout win week 1. This is kind of the first time you see this team go through some adversity. How do you think DeBoer kind of handled himself and handled things, when he was fielding questions and all that after the game?
I think he handled it well. He's just a different kind of guy. You're not going to get very many rants from him. Maybe not any rants at all from him. It's just not his style. I think, he said the right things. It was interesting that he said it wasn't a wake-up call and they just need to build on that. It doesn't necessarily have to be a wake-up call for Alabama, but it does have to be a learning lesson. And I think he recognized that. I think, he's probably a lot of the stuff that, went on, he really couldn't control too much. I mean, you do want to, have your team more disciplined, and I'm sure that's something he's going to work on. But a lot of that just comes down to the players and being more disciplined and being more, whether that's, on penalties or just, taking care of the ball. There was a lot of carelessness on the field. That's something that I'm sure he'll address. But as far as his message after the game, I thought it was, pretty expected. I think, I wouldn't really say one way or the other about it. A lot of DeBoer's press conferences, they don't really leave you feeling one way or the other. He's kind of vanilla in a lot of these, and I think for the most part he was in this one too. But that's just kind of his style. I think it would have been disingenuous if he would have tried to come out and been all fiery just to prove a point. That's not what he does. So I think it's just a matter of sticking true to your own style, and I think he'll probably address what he needs to address today, on Sunday, because Alabama practices on Sundays. So yeah.
Yeah, I think I agree with your take too, that I don't think it's bad that he said it wasn't a wake-up call versus it's an opportunity to learn from this, just because, wake-up call kind of feels more associated with the close loss or a narrow win over a team you should blow out. And they did get the blowout in the end. So you kind of saw, and I think they showed themselves, hey, this is the team we can be. We need to correct these things to do it through 4 quarters. Let's go into some of those things that they have to correct. And we talked about the penalties. Main sort of point of contention at right tackle, I think that's the best place to start. You mentioned Wilkin Formby. You wrote it in your column, 3 penalties, 129 yards. Elijah Pritchett, who had been battling with him with that right tackle spot, didn't play until the 4th quarter, then comes in. Alabama proceeds to have 2 explosive runs, a Jam Miller 56-yard touchdown and a Justice Haynes 29-yard touchdown, both off the right side, both featured good blocks by Pritchett. What did you make of all of that? Because there was, I think, a lot of people questioning why on earth didn't Pritchett play earlier. We learned there was some injury stuff, or we confirmed there was some injury stuff with him. But just that whole situation, obviously, Wilkin Formby, who had a pretty good day against Western Kentucky, not up to scratch at the right tackle, and Pritchett, comes in cold off the bench in the 4th and plays really well.
Yeah, it's like what we mentioned before. You mentioned those 129 yards. That's not what they were penalized. That's what they lost in would-be yardage on the that's what the yards they had, I guess, negated by his penalties. He struggled with holding. Alabama in general just struggled to move the ball on the ground and early and downs. Early in the game, I think things changed in the late, in the 4th quarter, where they got, I think, 137 of their yardage, their rushing yards in the 4th quarter alone. It wasn't a good day for Wilkin Formby. He's still a young player. He's basically a freshman. I know he's a redshirt freshman, but I mean, he didn't really play a lot his first year. So this is all new for him. We saw Caden Proctor make mistakes during his first year. You're going to see Wilkin Formby make mistakes. The puzzling thing too was the usage of Elijah Pritchett. According to our sources, and DeBoer kind of touched on it after the game. Elijah Pritchett didn't practice early in the week. Last week he was able to kind of practice, I think, on Thursday and Friday. I think the plan for Alabama was to hold him out, and then they kept on, we'll keep on holding him out. We'll keep on holding him out. And then eventually they had to use him late. I wonder, though, Jack, is there something else behind that? If somebody was a little bit banged up and you're holding them out, they sure waited a long time to pull the trigger, if that is the case. So there's questions there regardless. There's questions of, if that is the case, why did you let it go down to, basically midway through the 4th quarter with a close game? They put in Pritchett with 6 minutes left. So actually more than midway through. That's kind of a little late there to call it in terms of a guy that could make a difference on a struggling offensive line. It kind of makes you wonder, was there something beside the injury that maybe was he a little bit in the doghouse for some reason? This is all pure speculation, but could it be something where Alabama didn't want to play him to maybe prove a point, and then they kind of had to? That would be concerning if it was the case for multiple reasons. One, that they had to do that, and then 2, that they had to basically cave. So, I don't know if that's the case. For Alabama's sake, you would hope that that's not the case, because I think that just adds to the potential distractions coming out of this game with the false confidence that I said. And now if you have a player that, if you were trying to make a point and all of a sudden you have to cave and play him, I think that gives the player a little bit too much power. But like I said, those are all speculations. I don't want to we don't know that happened, so we're not going to really go down that road. But it was noticeable when Elijah Pritchett did come into the game. Alabama goes on a run and scores 4 touchdowns in its last 4 drives, and 2 of those came on long runs to the right side where he had a block. So he's obviously somebody that made a difference. I also thought, on top of all that, that it was interesting that Elijah Pritchett came in and subbed in for Wilkin Formby, and they still kept Tyler Booker at left tackle. Because if you remember, in the opener, Caden Proctor was out and Pritchett played left tackle. And then Alabama could have easily put Pritchett at left tackle, moved Booker back to left guard, and taken out Geno VanDeMark, who was struggling in the game as well. So, I mean, that's probably the more natural fit. And that might be what happens, if Caden Proctor can't play against Wisconsin. I would almost expect Pritchett to slide back into that left tackle role. But I think it gets really interesting. This is something I mentioned in my column. What if Proctor can come back against Wisconsin? You have him at that left tackle role. You're obviously going to slide Booker back to left guard, but what are you going to do at that right tackle spot? Because you have a player that looked way more impressive, at least last game, in Pritchett than Formby. But Formby won the battle during the preseason camp. He looked good against Western Kentucky. So I don't know. I think currently, if you had to ask me what Alabama was going to do, I would say that if Caden Proctor's back at left tackle, then Formby still starts the game at right tackle. But I could see Elijah Pritchett coming in at right tackle, and I think that battle is certainly on at right tackle regardless, and that it's not over. And I think Elijah Pritchett proved that he can still have quite a bit of say in that competition, even though it appeared that Wilkin Formby won it. We'll just have to see. The one thing I'll tell you, Jack, I do not like Tyler Booker at left tackle. I just think that look, Kalen DeBoer said some nice things about Tyler Booker. He did admirable, I guess, at left tackle for somebody that doesn't play left tackle. But at the same point, you've got a guy that he's not an elite left tackle. He's an elite left guard. So you're making one of your best linemen lesser of a player. And then the person that they had filling in for Tyler Booker, Geno VanDeMark, he struggled mightily. I think he should be thanking Wilkin Formby that the talk's not about the penalties that he cost the team, because he did just about as poorly as Wilkin Formby did. It's just everyone piled on Wilkin, because I think you look at that 74-yard touchdown, it's hard to ignore. But I just think that the answer, regardless, is to move Booker back to the left guard spot. I know he's capable of playing left tackle. It's somewhat encouraging that he was able to do it, and you still got to win. But I just don't like that move at all. You're kind of robbing Peter to pay Paul, and I never like doing that. So just play to your strengths, and if you have to be a little bit weaker at the tackle positions, then you still have one of the best interiors, and just maybe utilize that.
Yeah, I think it was interesting because that was, I think, the third option that we talked about heading into the game, was moving Booker out there and versus having Elijah Pritchett come out and start. And then you mentioned Geno VanDeMark as well, 3 penalties. This is a guy we've talked about as the possible first option off the bench for all 3 interior positions. And like you said, he struggled. I mean, how much of a concern is that, where you have a guy who supposedly can fill in at center, which, we're going to talk about a center mishap when we talk turnovers, but a guy who supposedly can fill in at center, left guard, and right guard, struggled in his first chance to do that against it was a confident South Florida side, but certainly they're not Georgia or Wisconsin.
Yeah, it's discouraging, because you liked the idea of having this starting caliber player being your backup at all 3 interior spots. And it's probably too early to just totally write off Geno VanDeMark. It's like these kind of games, it's really, easy to get into snap decisions of, okay, Wilkin Formby's terrible and Elijah Pritchett's definitely the best option, even though that hasn't been the case all month or last month. It's really easy to say, oh, Geno VanDeMark's terrible. We don't know that. He's a person that played a lot for Michigan State. He knows the offensive line coach. Alabama grabbed him for a reason. I think he's still probably a somewhat capable starter if he has to fill in. He just had a bad game, I think That's not to say if he had to play against Wisconsin or if he had to play against Georgia, that he couldn't turn around and have a good game. I think he's capable. I just think it's not what you want to see from him in his first time out. I think it's just really there's a lot of unknowns right now about the offensive line. There were already those unknowns at both tackle positions, and now having one of the players hurt just really scrambles things up a little bit even more. That's why I think you go with what you know. And you keep somebody like Booker at the guard position because you just don't want to play with all these uncertainties and have people at positions that you don't want them at. Just take advantage of your strengths and then kind of try to deal with your weaknesses. That being said, to answer your question, I wouldn't write off Geno VanDeMark. There's a reason why he's not starting over a guy like Tyler Booker, and I think it highlights the difference of going from the dominant play at left guard to somebody that had a bad game. It's just it kind of magnifies that a little bit more when you're replacing a guy like Booker at that position.
Yeah, I think I agree with you. I like the take of just keeping the solidity and the players in the best position they're in where you can, and then filling the holes, with more like for like replacements at the tackle spot. I think that's important for this team. Let's kind of stay on the offensive line slightly, but let's talk about some of these turnovers. Alabama had 3 of them. The one we'll talk about first, I think the one that maybe gets the most attention, or that got the most attention after the game, Jalen Milroe fumbling on the 5-yard line. Alabama's got a goal to go situation. Looked like it was a bad snap. What did you see? What did we kind of learn? We talked to Parker Brailsford after the game.
Yeah, it looked like it was more just like on Jalen. If you look at the close up, it didn't really look like anything. Now we don't know the communication. Was it was he totally not ready for it, or I don't know the in sync, behind the scenes or what a normal snap feels and looks like for them. So there might be something off about it that we just can't see, but it just really looks like a mistake from Jalen Milroe. But if there is any miscommunication or anything like that, it's kind of concerning now because, snaps were obviously one of the biggest problems in last year's team. It's really the Achilles heel of Alabama and really cost them a chance at a title. Because if you look at some of the missed opportunities they had in the Michigan game where they lost, bad snaps were haunting in those games. So it's concerning that there's been back-to-back games with a bad snap. You saw Parker Brailsford snap one over Jalen Milroe's head in the first game, and they called that a communication error. When we talked to Jalen Milroe, he mentioned communication again. So, if that's the case, it's not going to get any easier. I mean, they got Camp Randall next week. That place is going to be rocking. If you don't have the communication down, you don't want to go 3 straight games with a snapping problem, so that is something to monitor. And, I talked a lot about the line I had from, my story is there's been a lot of talk about the yellow flags in this one, but that's a huge red flag moving forward. I think that it's something to at least be a little bit concerned about. Now, whether or not you want to call that a bad snap or whatever, it was a failed snap because at any time the quarterback doesn't get the ball, it's a failed snap, whether it's the quarterback's fault or the snapper's fault. So that's just something that Alabama's got to continue to work on. It's more focus, more discipline. It's this whole game, everything we're going to talk about, focus, discipline. I'm going to sound like a broken record, but that's another example of it.
The other 2 penalties, you mentioned the focus, the discipline. Jam Miller fumbling after a long run. Kendrick Law fumble after maybe an explosive play. It just felt like every explosive play was cursed to fail in some sort of comedic or sloppy fashion. What'd you think of those 2 plays?
He had a big kick return, and then he fumbles. A big run, he fumbles, or a touchdown run, called back for holding. It's just like, you saw some of those clips of Nick Sheridan in the box just be like, are you kidding me? He said a little bit worse than that, but it was just more like he was losing his mind because every single play he had, something bad would happen. And so it's got to be frustrating. It's got to be frustrating for the coaching staff. Obviously, it was frustrating for the fans and for the players. I mean, it's got to kind of get in your head at a moment, too. It's like where every time we do something good, something bad happens right after it. So part of that shaking it off and just chalking it up to a bad game. You don't want to let those kind of get in your head. At the same time, I think whatever form of discipline or whatever form of whatever Kalen DeBoer is going to do to get that focus up. I don't know if they have to every time you drop a ball in practice, or fumble a ball in practice, you have to run 20 laps or whatever, whatever they want to do to stop that. That's, be up to Kalen DeBoer and his staff, but you got to fix those problems. You can't be fumbling the ball, especially you can't be having the fact that Alabama won with 13 penalties and 3 fumbles, all of which they lost. That's kind of crazy that they won, especially that they won by 26 points. I mean, that's kind of an insane stat when you look at all that. That it just shows you though that you're like, that's probably shows you more about the talent gap between those two teams and how Alabama was just really able to wear down South Florida. They're not going to be able to do that against Georgia. They're not going to be able to do it. I think that they'll actually have an easier time against Wisconsin than they did against South Florida. But I think when you look at those kind of mistakes, if you had that kind of game, if they have 13 penalties next week and 3 turnovers, I don't think they're winning it. I think that, there is a certain point where a team like Wisconsin's going to be able to beat you. So it'll be interesting. I think they're going to fix it. I think they're going to, I don't think the sky's completely falling for Alabama, but it's, it's frustrating from a fan standpoint, I'm sure. And from a scheming standpoint. So it's definitely something that needs to be fixed.
Something that just came into my head while you were saying that, and DeBoer was kind of touching on this when he was talking about the offensive line play, is just this team understanding that the wins can't happen off of explosive plays alone. You have to be able to go methodically down the field, churn out, longer drives and be consistent every play and not just, like you said, rely on those explosive plays. I wonder, does a game like this more emphasize that fact, or does it maybe, make you a little worried that, they had these explosive plays. It was just like, oh, they got taken away by a silly fumble or a silly penalty. We just will look to limit those. I almost just wonder, where the mentality goes on that in terms of it didn't really affect the methodical drives. It affected those explosive plays. And we didn't really see, again, Alabama kind of march down the field like we kind of wanted to.
Yeah. I mean, I think that, there was how many scoring plays that they have that they score. I think they're both their first 2 touchdown plays were 10 and 11 play drives. So I mean, like on the plus side, you did see some methodical plays from Alabama. You already kind of know that this team can do the explosive plays. So I don't think it's necessarily, I mean, as frustrating as it is to see the penalties take those away, it's kind of like, I think that, it's not like you're concerned about Alabama's big play ability. I'm not sure, is that what you were asking, or?
I think it's just more, I don't know. I guess I'm just curious your take on what DeBoer said about that, where he's like, we can't just keep relying on these explosive plays, versus kind of methodically going down the field and
I mean, I guess the positive to this is they did get to go down methodically a little bit more in this game. Yeah. I mean, it wasn't really hard to get that. I mean, they didn't really do that at all in the first game. So it's like, it was a little bit better this week, but I think when you look at the reliance on the big play, I think it comes down, Jack, to they're not able to run the ball, or when they're not doing it, they're not able to run the ball on first and second down, or they're getting 2 or 3 yards. I think defenses are able to stack the box because they pretty much know that Alabama can't execute those intermediate passes right now. So you're able to kind of make Alabama more one-dimensional on first and second down. That's, you're creating a lot of 3rd and 7, 3rd and 5s even. And those are kind of tough. Whereas if you would get, 4 yards on first down or 5 yards on first down, you can create a lot of these 3rd and 2s. I think that's where you're able to kind of stack up methodical drives. So I think some of that will help when Caden Proctor comes back and you can, keep Tyler Booker at left guard, and maybe you could find the better of the 2 right tackles. And as Alabama's offensive line kind of stabilizes itself, like, I think we're going to see a little bit better than that.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, there is kind of a reliance on the big play. And I guess, you did kind of see that where they weren't scoring because some of those big plays were taken away. But yeah, it is kind of, it is what it is right now. I think you're going to need improvement both from your quarterback, and your offensive line is going to have to kind of get back to full health. And even then, it's probably going to take a maybe 2 or 3 week gelling period. So it's really going to be kind of like, how much can Alabama survive in these next few weeks? Can they put a good performance in against Wisconsin, and then maybe use that bye week to kind of help gel. And then that Georgia game at the end of the month is going to be a big one, just as in terms of a checkpoint of how much this team has grown. But there's a lot of growth that needs to happen on offense in order to be a true playoff contender against good teams. This is obviously an offense that has a lot of talent and has a lot of ability, and it can make plays when it needs to. And if you're worn down, it can hit you on big plays. But against good defenses that are going to be able to withstand 4 quarters, it's going to be tough. You're going to have to be able to do a lot more than what Alabama has shown through the first 2 games.
Yeah, I think that's just what I was getting at. It's just, I think this game just perplexes me. I mean, you mentioned those, they had 3 drives over 10 plays. 2 of them did end in touchdowns. They fumbled on the other one. And then just 4 in the fourth quarter, 4 plays, 34 yards, 3 plays, 75 yards, 2 plays, 60 yards, 1 plays, 29 yards. They all ended in touchdowns. Only one of those drives took more than a minute off of the clock. And I think it's just, it's such a perplexing thing to look at, I think, with this game in particular. So yeah, it's just going to be, think about how
Alabama's had a ton of 3 and outs for a team that's played, Western Kentucky and South Florida. It's too many 3 and outs,
Yeah.
I think that's been too much of a problem. And then you look at it too, Jack. I mean, like even one of those extended drives, right? You can almost take one of those away, because I thought that the penalty on the pass interference penalty on Ryan Williams on the second drive, I think that was a soft pass interference call. A little bit of a home cooking call right there. And that really helped Alabama. They were able to kind of extend that drive and get things going. And that was a longer drive. But the tune would have definitely been changed had, that been just a regular incomplete pass and Alabama was punting on twice on the first, 6 plays. That's rough. And that's you're right. That is something that they, kind of got to consider. And even that play, right, is another explosive play. It's another big time. You just took a shot. You didn't really work your way down the field. So, that's something to consider. I mean, it's something to look at for moving forward for sure.
Let's talk about some of the good before we get into Jalen Milroe. The defense you wrote about it, Tim Keenan in particular. I think I could even tell from watching up in the press box the kind of tone he was setting on defense just for this team. 9 tackles, 2.5 for loss, 1.5 sacks, had a quarterback hurry as well. Q Robinson had another bright game, got his 2nd sack, which put South Florida field goal range. Jahad Campbell had 11 tackles. That led the team. This Alabama red zone defense, too, 1 touchdown in 6 opposing red zone drives so far this season. Obviously, Western Kentucky, South Florida, take that for what it's worth. But what did you think of Keenan and just kind of the defense, maybe their attitude, the way they kind of stepped up when things were sputtering for a good chunk of this game?
Yeah, Alabama chose its team captains perfectly. The 4 players that they picked were, the 4 biggest leaders on this team. Next year, if you're trying to guess who's going to be a team captain when, Jalen Milroe is probably going to leave, Tyler Booker's going to leave, Malachi Moore is going to leave, and probably Deontay Lawson. They're all probably I'd be shocked if Tim Keenan, if he's still a part of this team, and then, he's going to be one of those team captains. He is a leader kind of player. I think he's won a leadership award. I think it was some kind of I forget what it was, but I think it was some kind of religious. It had to do with some kind of religious thing, and so he's a guy that's won some kind of like leadership honor in the off season. And then just look at the impact that he made on the team. I think he was like pumping up the defense, and that defense needed to kind of get some jolt of energy, because it was kept on it would get a big stop, and then it's really easy to get worn down when you make a big stop and then your offense just goes 3 and out, like you were talking about. You're right back on the field, and it's really easy to get kind of like gassed. And I think having a guy like Tim Keenan, whether it's just the plays he was making, or you just saw the animation and just how he kind of like pumped people up, I thought that was really important, just from a leadership standpoint, both with his play and his demeanor. But he was everywhere. I mean, he made some big stops on third down, some pressures on third downs. But I think, just as big as that is he set up those third downs by being a brick wall in the running game. He stopped talked about, those you talked about that happening to Alabama, where they couldn't get first and second down yardage. That was the case too for South Florida, where they couldn't really run up the middle because Tim Keenan was stuffing things for either a loss or 2 yards. And then you set up those longer plays. So he was great. I really liked what I saw from him. Jahad Campbell's really doing well in his first 2 games. He's a guy that's doing well. Q Robinson is a guy that, has 2 games, back-to-back games with a sack. And I saw something tweeted about Q Robinson losing. Did he lose his father 2 days before? I mean, geez, I can't imagine, having that happen, and then just his resolve to play and to put in a performance like that 2 days after that happened. Just really kudos to him. I mean, mentally strong performance there. And it's good to see, being him able to, honor his father in that way and really do a performance that would make his father proud. So, there's a lot of inspired efforts on defense that, I thought this defense did probably even better than the 16 points that they allowed, just because they were on the field so much. They constantly had to bail out the offense, which was struggling. It's almost like you look at a performance like this, and you could look at the time of possession. It wasn't that bad, but I think it's like when you look at pitching, right? And there's you like pitches with runners on base, and like the high impact pitches where they take more of a toll on your arm because you're really giving your extra to get out, or you're throwing a little bit harder to get out of an inning. I think that's kind of what happened with Alabama's defense, where they put a little bit more oomph, and they were required to like maybe put a little bit more strain because the game's tight, and they're constantly put into tough situations where they really couldn't let South Florida move. And I think they did an excellent job of that. And I think, obviously I gave my game ball to Tim Keenan. I think he was the spearhead in all of that.
Absolutely. Just on Q Robinson, I know he shared a nice moment with DeBoer after the game, which was great to see. And yeah, I totally agree. I think there's a lot to like about this defense. The one touchdown they gave up was obviously they were set up on their own 39, or Alabama's 39 after the Jam Miller fumble. So I think for the situations they were put in at times, they're really, really good. Finishing things off, Jalen Milroe, probably the man on the subject of most conversations after the game, aside from Wilkin and Formby. 17 of 27, 199 yards, 2 touchdowns. He also had one of the weirdest rushing stat lines I've ever seen. Obviously, it's still a weird thing in college football that they count sacks against rushing yards, but he had 12 carries for 2 yards and 2 touchdowns. You're going to see that sometimes with quarterbacks. Through 2 games, Tony, you mentioned this, he's completed 66.7% of his passes. And then on those intermediate throws, which is I think the thing you'll get into, 2 of 5 last night on throws that traveled between 10 and 19 yards. How concerning was his performance for you, and where, do things kind of stand with him in terms of being, having the expectations he's had, the things he said this offseason, the things he's continued to say, hasn't all the way shown up, I think, in a lot of people's eyes this year.
I think some of the argument following this game is like, or surrounding Jalen, has been like, I think his defenders have been like, well, he wasn't bad. And I agree with that. He wasn't bad. Jalen wasn't the reason why Alabama was struggling early on. He just wasn't the reason why they weren't struggling. You would think if he is, the leader of your offense, if he is a second-year quarterback, you're almost going to want him to go above and beyond and be the reason why you're able to break through some of those, problems in protection, or you want him to be able to step through that pressure and make plays. And he's an experienced quarterback now. He's no longer that first-year quarterback where, of course, if he doesn't have pressure, he's going to get rattled. And like, he needs to kind of progress. If Alabama is going to truly be a contender, they're going to need more from him. They're going to need him to be that NFL caliber quarterback, or at least the way that they're trying to run their offense right now. They're going to need him to be that NFL caliber quarterback. And I think Jalen still can be that, but he's going to have to mature as a passer. He's going to have to make those intermediate passes. He's going to have to get rid of the ball sooner. He's going to have to, step up in pressure and not, get flushed out, not take 10-yard sacks. It's just a maturity thing. I'm sure he's going to look at his tape, and he's a hard worker. He's going to continue to try to grind and get better, but you're going to have to start seeing those that maturity kind of happen as a passer, not just somebody that can make plays with, his athleticism, whether it's a long throw or whether it's, obviously the plays he can make with his legs. I think you're just going to need him to kind of see the field a little bit better, to have a little bit more awareness, a little bit more calmness, and he's capable of doing all that. This is nothing that he's, oh, he just doesn't have the makeup or anything like that. I don't believe that. I think he's got it all there. It needs to develop. It needs to start happening on the field, if it doesn't, I think there's a cap on what this offense can be, so and I think that's what we saw. I think we saw, okay, well, Alabama, Jalen can make some plays with his legs, and but you're going to run into lulls like you did if you're not able to kind of break down defenses. And so that's something that they're going to have to work on. It's something that's probably going to haunt them a little bit next week, and it's definitely going to haunt them against Georgia. And then there's a whole slew of SEC games where it's definitely going to be a problem if they don't fix it. So it's better to have these struggles now and to try to fix them. And then they still have, a game next week. And then what I feel is going to be a very important off week. Jalen is going to try to grow and learn through those 2 weeks. And I'm sure that's going to make a lot of difference as well. But yeah, it's time to, if it's going to happen, you're almost, once you get into like a month into the season, you're going to want to start seeing some of that improvement that we've been hopeful to see and that we've been kind of talking about seeing. It kind of seemed like he took a step back in that progression against South Florida. Not to say he didn't like, you look at those numbers, they're not terrible numbers. It's just they weren't great. And I think when you're going to have to start judging Jalen on a great scale, not on a just like he didn't have a bad game scale.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I totally agree. I think that's the exact most frustrating part is what's there and what can be there as a fan, and then it doesn't quite get there even if the numbers don't look horrible. They can be better, and he can make more of a difference for this team, like you said, not being the difference in why they don't lose, but being the reason why they win. So right. I think I totally agree. They that's where those frustrations lie. And yeah, it's going to be a big one against Wisconsin. And then maybe you have that bye week to rekindle things a little bit more, but, and then it gets real, like you said, for the rest of the year, because you're at that month into the season. So going to be interesting to see where he kind of develops. Any final thoughts, takeaways from week 2? Obviously we get a little bit more of an exotic matchup.
I would just say there's a certain amount of this game that you just need to flush from an Alabama perspective. They need to learn off of it, but there's a lot of overreactions I think you can take from this one. And I just don't, like, we've kind of went into it, I don't necessarily think Wilkin Formby is a bad offensive lineman. I don't think that Pritchett's just certifiably the answer at right tackle. I don't think Jalen's a lost cause at quarterback. The only thing I think I'm certain of right now, Jack, is that Ryan Williams is an absolute stud and will be in the NFL in 3 years.
Wow, we did make it.
I'm almost like, I'm ready to jump to that conclusion.
We made it almost 38 minutes without talking about him. So that was good on us. But did have the touchdown.
He's good. And he, we talked about a little bit, about the big plays. And I think entering this game, we talked a little bit about he's going to have to be the guy that moves the ball a little bit more for Alabama. We talked about like the big plays and sustaining drives. And we talked about if, Ryan Williams is going to be the true number one receiver, that he can't just be on the end of home run balls. He needs to move the ball. And he had 4 catches, a team high 4 catches for 68 yards. So it wasn't just that 43-yarder. He did have 3 other catches. And I think that's encouraging as well, that it's not just home run or bust for him, although he now does have 3 home runs on the season, and definitely a person that can make a big play. That's probably the one thing I'm sure of, but everything else, I think that I don't think anyone's the best or the worst after 2 games. I think you just kind of have to, I hate, how cliche some of the players have been with this 1-0 mentality, but there is a point to it. You just got to kind of move on. You can't, take too many. You can take some takeaways from each of these games, but it gets to a point where you're going to have to do it all over again next week. And I don't think we've really seen the full story on Alabama in a lot of regards. So I guess we'll be here next week and we'll learn more with another. We've been talking about it's a step up every time. I think this is obviously going to be the biggest test. It not only playing a Power 5 team, a Big 10 team, you're playing them in a tough place to play. So we'll just see how Alabama does against Wisconsin, and I think that we'll get an even better look at it next week.
Got to keep staying patient with some of these results. Seems to be the summary of that. We will be covering that. We'll have a pod before Wisconsin. Go subscribe to Tide Illustrated. We have a bunch of good stuff, a bunch of good stories from the game. That touched on everything we just said. You can read more in depth on it. Subscribe here. We'll have the coaches and players all week long. So building up to Wisconsin, keep it here. Subscribe, and we will see you next time.